America is now entering its 5th century of educating students. For every generation of Americans throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and now the 21st centuries, a good education has been a major emphasis. It was that way when the first colonists arrived here 4 centuries ago, and that goal remains unchanged today. Yet by what standard should a good education be measured? It must be measured by more than just technological advances. It must also be measured by how much content a student has learned and how well that student has been taught to think and to reason. Unfortunately, there's abundant evidence that while the technological advances in this generation have been significant, the cognitive advances have not been nearly as great. Consider, for example, this 1862 geography test from Chicago Public Schools. Notice some of the 4th grade questions in 1862. How many degrees of longitude are there? How many degrees wide are the temperate zones? What is a watershed? Name the principal animals of the frigid zones. This represented basic 4th grade knowledge in 1862. That same year, this math text, Ray's Arithmetic, was one of the most popular elementary math texts in American schools. Notice some elementary math questions from 1862. I insured 2/3 of a shop worth $3,600 and 4/5 of a house worth $6,000, paying $126. What was the rate of insurance? Or, how much money must be given with 9 $100 shares at 15% discount in exchange for 8 $100 bonds at 2% discount? And these were elementary math problems. This math book for elementary students provides exercises that students had to solve mentally only. That is, only in their minds. No pencils, no papers allowed. Notice some of the mental math problems for elementary students in 1877. A boat worth $864, of which 1/8 belonged to A, 1/4 to B, and the rest to C, was lost. What loss did each sustain, it having been insured for $500? This was a mental math problem in elementary schools in 1877. Here's another. On a farm, there are 60 animals: horses, cows, and sheep. For each horse, there are 3 cows, and for each cow, there are 2 sheep. How many animals of each kind? Or try this one. If 7 men can do a piece of work in 4 days, in what time can it be done if 3 of the men leave when the work is half completed? In 1877, these were math problems that elementary students solved in their minds. Or try a few basic history questions from 1882. History questions about the United States Constitution. What is a writ of habeas corpus? What is a bill of attainder? What is an ex post facto law? Enumerate the powers denied to the several states. What are bills of credit? How many elementary students today, or even adults in this so-called modern and advanced generation, could answer such elementary academic questions as these from a century ago? Consider one final example of the educational content of previous generations. It is this book, The Federalist Papers. Written in the years 1787 and 1788 by 3 prominent founding fathers, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, this work explained to the citizens of the new United States why a federal constitution was needed. Even today, this work is still considered the single most authoritative source on the intent of the Constitution. There's currently a law professor in Alabama who requires his law students to read this book, all of it. And why not? Before they can become attorneys, they'll swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. So why not learn about the intent of the document they'll swear to uphold? Yet those law students, enrolled in today's graduate level legal studies, regularly complain to him about the difficulty of reading that old book. That professor nods sympathetically and responds, "I understand. This book was not written for someone at your educational level. This book was written for the common, average, upstate New York farmer of 1787. Perhaps someday you, as a graduate student, will attain the educational level of those early New York farmers." Indisputably, our early educational system was remarkable. In fact, since it was responsible for producing the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world, it is worth looking more closely at what, for 4 centuries, made the American educational system so successful and so different from all others. America has the most successful form of government of any nation in the history of the world. Yet consider those who originated our form of government, those who penned our original governmental documents. Where did they get the unique ideas that have caused America to be so different from all other nations? Perhaps the answer is found in an axiom often attributed to President Abraham Lincoln.
The philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next.
Very simply, it was the philosophy of the schoolroom 2 centuries ago that produced the unique American philosophy of government. So let's begin by looking at the philosophy of the classroom in the schools from which our early leaders graduated, schools such as Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Harvard was started by the Congregationalists as a school to train ministers of the gospel. It produced signers of the Declaration such as John Adams, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, William Ellery, William Hooper, Robert Treat Paine, William Williams, and Elbridge Gerry, and signers of the Constitution such as William Samuel Johnson and Rufus King, and other prominent leaders including Fisher Ames, a framer of the Bill of Rights, William Cushing, an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and Timothy Pickering, an American general during the Revolution and the Secretary of War for Presidents George Washington and John Adams. Harvard trained a number of our founding fathers. What was its educational philosophy? The answer to that question is set forth in Harvard's 2 mottos: for Christ and the Church, and for the glory of Christ. Consistent with its 2 mottos, Harvard told its students,
"Let every student be plainly instructed and consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus, which is eternal life, John 17:3, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning."
To help students place Christ as the foundation of learning, Harvard instituted specific educational practices.
"Everyone shall so exercise himself in reading the Scriptures twice a day, that he shall be ready to give such an account of his proficiency therein."
At Harvard, academic endeavors were built upon the foundation of biblical principles, and this was a philosophy of education that produced a significant number of those who founded our philosophy of government. Yale was another popular school of that day, and like Harvard, it was started by Congregationalists as a school to train ministers of the gospel. It produced signers of the Declaration such as Lyman Hall, Philip Livingston, Lewis Morris, and Oliver Wolcott, and signers of the Constitution such as Abraham Baldwin, Jared Ingersoll, and William Livingston, and other prominent leaders, including Noah Webster, a famous educator and the author of the dictionary that still bears his name, Zephaniah Swift, author of the first American legal text, and James Kent, a leading judge called a father of American jurisprudence. Yale admonished his students,
"Above all, have an eye to the great end of all your studies, which is to obtain the clearest conceptions of divine things and to lead you to a saving knowledge of God in His Son, Jesus Christ."
In pursuit of this goal, Yale required,
All the scholars are required to live a religious and blameless life according to the rules of God's Word, diligently reading the Holy Scriptures and constantly attending all the duties of religion.
Yale, like Harvard, provided an education based on knowing Christ and studying the Scriptures. Perhaps the school that produced more early national leaders than any other was Princeton. Princeton had been started by the Presbyterians as a school to train ministers of the gospel. And it produced signers of the Declaration such as Richard Stockton and Benjamin Rush, and signers of the Constitution such as Gunning Bedford, Jonathan Dayton, James Madison, and William Patterson, and other prominent early leaders, including Oliver Ellsworth, a Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Henry Lee, a general in the American Revolution known as Light Horse Harry Lee, and William Bradford, the U.S. Attorney General under President George Washington. Many Princeton graduates were personally trained by University President John Witherspoon, who was himself a signer of the Declaration. What did John Witherspoon require of students at Princeton?
Every student shall attend worship in the college hall morning and evening, and shall attend public worship on the Sabbath. There shall be assigned to each class certain exercises for their religious instruction. and no student belonging to any class shall neglect them.
Here are some of Witherspoon's lectures, and he personally taught students.
He is the best friend to American liberty, who is most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself with the greatest firmness to bear down on profanity and immorality of every kind. Whoever is an avowed enemy of God, I hesitate not to call him an enemy to his country.
Dr. Witherspoon taught that a true friend of liberty in America would promote religion and bear down on profanity and immorality. Why? Because it was understood that American government was merely a reflection of American citizens. If citizens became profane and immoral, the government would become profane and immoral. And history has proven that such governments do not survive. So naturally, a friend of America would promote religion and morality. Not only did prominent American educators such as John Witherspoon equip students with a biblical foundation in academic education, but they were so committed to sound education for all students that they directly confronted 2 centuries of tradition and law imposed on them by the British and founded some of the first schools for women and for African Americans, something unheard of at that time. For example, John Witherspoon personally trained a number of African American students at Princeton, including John Chavez, who went on to become a famous preacher and educator in North Carolina. And Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration, was also instrumental in the early development of African American education. And Benjamin Franklin, a signer of both the Declaration and the Constitution, helped found a series of schools for African Americans, training students both in academics and in the principles of Christianity. And Benjamin Rush, another signer of the Declaration, helped open education for women and was intimately involved with the first American school to educate women. These founding fathers and many others set a new direction for education by pioneering education for all children, regardless of race or gender. America's first public education laws had been passed at about the same time that Harvard had been established. Those laws proceeded directly from the experiences of the early settlers who'd arrived in America. Those settlers were still concerned about the civil atrocities that had occurred in Europe. Those atrocities, such as the Inquisition and the Crusades, too often had occurred under the banner of Christianity. And America's early immigrants were convinced that the widespread illiteracy and lack of biblical knowledge that had characterized Europe in those days had been at the root of these atrocities. The civil and religious leaders in Europe had told the people that the Bible authorized such atrocities, and because the people were illiterate and therefore could not read the Scriptures to judge the accuracy of what their leaders told them, they blindly followed and believed all they were told, thus indirectly contributing to those atrocities. The American settlers were convinced that if the common people could read and could learn the Word of God for themselves, then they would resist government misbehavior. Therefore, to preclude such occurrences in America, in 1642 they passed America's first public school law. It is contained in this book, the Code of Laws of 1650. By the way, notice that the cover of books at that time were often made out of thin slices of wood covered with paper. This is what constituted a hardback book. Interestingly, America's first educational law was called the Old Deluder Satan Act, and it declared,
"It being one chief project of that old deluder Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures, as in former time."
And on the law continued, requiring that public schools be started in each community so that American students would have a sound academic education based on God's Word. This Bible-centered emphasis in education was common in subsequent education laws as well, a fact confirmed by the records of foreign visitors to America. Following America's surprising success as an independent nation, foreign observers would travel here to investigate what had caused America's rapid rise. These foreign visitors would document our various customs and practices and then return to their native countries and publish the results of their investigations. One such foreign visitor was Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville. His observations on the religious nature of American public education are recorded in his work. Originally called The Republic of the United States of America and its Political Institutions Reviewed and Examined, today it is simply called Democracy in America. Briton Edward Kendall was another foreign visitor who reported the same fact about the religious element in public education in America in his 3-volume set. As he traveled from state to state, he would document the diverse aspects of American life, from courts of justice to Indian missions, from prison systems to theaters and public entertainments. While in Connecticut, Kendall had examined American education, and he found the state's illiteracy law of interest, particularly the opening declaration of that law.
This legislature, observing that, notwithstanding our former orders made for the education of children, there are many persons unable to read the English tongue, and thereby incapable of reading the holy word of God or the good laws of this state.
Notice the reason that the Connecticut legislature had been concerned about illiteracy. If a child could not read, then he would not know the word of God or the laws of the state. This meant that if the legislature enacted a law that contradicted the word of God, then citizens might not prevent its passage. Another famous education law was called the Northwest Ordinance. It was the first federal law to address education. Significantly, that law was passed at the identical time and by the identical founding fathers who drafted the First Amendment, the very same amendment that the courts now interpret as prohibiting the presence of religious activities in public schools. Interestingly, Article 3 of that federal law directly linked religion and public education together, declaring,
"Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged."
The founders believed, and the first federal educational law established, that schools and education systems were a proper means to encourage the religion, morality, and knowledge that was so necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Our founding fathers did not believe that encouraging religion in schools was unconstitutional. Rather, they believed just the opposite. Only in recent decades have courts ruled otherwise. An indication of how long religious lessons remained a part of public education in America is seen in these two textbooks, used in Dallas public schools until 1974. One is a Bible study course of the Old Testament, and the other is a Bible study course of the New Testament. Both were credit courses for graduation. Notice the lessons. Lesson 1 in the New Testament course begins with questions based on John chapter 1. Where was Christ before he was born on earth? What titles did John apply to Christ in this chapter? For what purpose was John sent by God? Name 5 things the angel told Mary concerning her child Jesus. What does the word Jesus mean? And there are many other similar questions. At the end of lesson 1 is memory work. Memorize the pre-existence of Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. Such textbooks were reflective of the requirements of that original federal law that public schools address religion, morality, and knowledge. But the effect of that law was seen in more than just textbooks. It was also quite evident in state constitutions. For example, when Ohio penned its first state constitution in 1802, that constitution declared,
"Religion, morality, and knowledge being essentially necessary to the good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of instruction shall forever be encouraged by legislative provision."
The same provision was present in the constitutions of state after state, including Mississippi, Kansas, Nebraska, and so many others. In fact, that provision is still found in current state constitutions today. This book from 1893 is yet a further confirmation of how American education inculcated the 3 elements of religion, morality, and knowledge set forth in that early federal law. 1892 was the 400th anniversary of Columbus Day, celebrated that year by a huge international festival in Chicago. The various trades and professions prepared records of their progress over the previous 4 centuries, and this book was prepared by the Kansas Teachers Organization to review the history of education in America during that time. The book confirms that, in its words, education was nurtured in the lap of the church, but that as the nation grew and the number of inhabitants in America increased, the church voluntarily relinquished control of elementary education to the state. Yet the philosophy of education did not change. In fact, the state superintendent of public instruction even declared,
"If the study of the Bible is to be excluded from all state schools, If the inculcation of the principles of Christianity is to have no place in the daily program, if the worship of God is to form no part of the general exercises of these public elementary schools, then the good of the state would be better served by restoring all schools to church control.
State public education leaders believed that if public education ever reached the point that it did not inculcate religion, morality, and knowledge, that it did not teach the Bible in schools, did not inculcate the principles of Christianity, and did not incorporate the daily worship of God, then the country would be better off if the state gave all of its schools back to the church. So closely was religious faith embraced as a part of a sound public education, even on the university level, that in 1860, 262 out of 288 college presidents were ministers of the gospel, as were more than a third of all university faculty members. And in 1890, James Angell, president of the University of Vermont and the University of Michigan, reported that over 90% of the state universities that he surveyed conducted chapel services. At half of the state universities, chapel attendance was compulsory, and a quarter of the state universities required regular church attendance in addition to chapel attendance. This was the practice of state universities, simply continuing the philosophy of education that had caused America to become the most successful and prosperous nation in the history of the world. Interestingly, many of America's early educational leaders had also been patriots who had fought for the establishment of America as an independent nation during the Revolutionary War. They understood that if America was to endure beyond the American Revolution, then the principles on which America had been birthed, nurtured, and developed must be successfully transmitted to future generations. It was for this reason that so many of those early patriots became directly involved in writing educational plans, authoring textbooks, or starting universities. One of those early educational leaders was Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence who also served in 3 presidential administrations. Dr. Rush had helped found 5 colleges, 3 of which still exist today. He was also a university professor, authored numerous textbooks, and was possibly the first founding father following the ratification of the Constitution to propose nationwide public schools, for which he may be titled the Father of Public Schools under the Constitution. In one of his famous educational policy papers, A Defense of the Use of the Bible as a School Book, Dr. Rush set forth nearly a dozen reasons why the Bible should always remain the principal textbook in American education. He closed that piece with a succinct warning on what would happen in America if the Bible were removed from schools.
In contemplating the political institutions of the United States, I lament that if we remove the Bible from schools, we waste so much time and money in punishing crimes and take so little pains to prevent them. For this divine book, above all others, favors that equality among mankind, that respect for just laws, and those sober and frugal virtues which constitute the soul of our government.
Since the Bible dealt with the heart, the source of all crime, Dr. Rush saw the Bible as the only sure means to prevent crime. He therefore predicted that if we ceased to teach the Bible in schools, then America would expend great quantities of time and money in punishing crime. Another famous leader with clear views on education was Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris was a signer of the Constitution and was the most active member of the Constitutional Convention. In fact, he was chosen by his peers at the convention to take their rough ideas and create the polished language that would form the Constitution. Gouverneur Morris literally produced the actual wording of that document and is therefore titled the penman of the Constitution. 2 years after he had helped create America's government, Morris penned 2 works to help the French in the creation of their new government. Morris outlined for the French the principles that we had utilized in our own successful system and encouraged them to implement the same. Notice his recommendation on education.
Religion is the only solid basis of good morals. Therefore, education should teach the precepts of religion and the duties of man towards God.
The penman of our Constitution believed that it was appropriate for schools to teach religion. Another important early leader with strong views on education was Fisher Ames. Ames helped frame the Bill of Rights in the very first federal Congress. In fact, He proposed the final wording for the First Amendment that was passed by the House. This book contains the writings of Fisher Ames, including his article entitled School Books. In that piece, Ames commented on a growing trend he had observed in American education.
It has been the custom of late years to put a number of little books into the hands of children containing fables and moral lessons. This is very well because it is right first to raise curiosity and then to guide it. Many books for children are, however, injudiciously compiled.
Ames then pointed out a dangerous unintended consequence from placing more books into the hands of children. He explained that each time a new book was added to the classroom, time was spent on that new book. The growing time spent on the many new books could eventually reduce the time students spent on the Bible. To this possibility, Fisher Ames strongly objected.
Why then, if these books for children must be retained, as they will be, should not the Bible regain the place it once held as a school book? Its morals are pure, its examples captivating and noble. The reverence for the sacred book that is thus early impressed lasts long, and probably, if not impressed in infancy, never takes firm hold of the mind.
Fisher Ames, a primary author of the First Amendment, warned that the Bible must never be pushed to the back of the classroom, much less completely out of schools. A number of other early statesmen and educators agreed. John Quincy Adams, a U.S. president and a university professor at Harvard, had similarly declared,
To a man of liberal education, with regard to the history contained in the Bible, it is not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it.
And founding father Henry Lawrence, a president of Congress, echoed,
The Bible is a necessary part of a polite education.
And Dr. Benjamin Rush had announced,
The Bible should be read in our schools in preference to all other books.
Today, however, the Bible has been pushed not just to the back of the classroom, it's been pushed completely out of the classroom, supposedly in the name and by the authority of the same early leaders who worked so hard to put the Bible in the classroom and to keep it there. Noah Webster was another famous American with a significant impact on education. He was a soldier during the American Revolution, a legislator, a judge, and was responsible for part of the language in the Constitution. As an educator, Webster helped found Amherst College, and he authored scores of textbooks on a number of different subjects, including the famous dictionary that bears his name. His impact on education was so profound that he's been titled the Schoolmaster to America. The first textbook penned by Webster was his famous Speller. Introduced in 1783, it became the spelling book for American schools for the next 150 years. In later years, that speller was popularly known as Webster's blueback speller because of the distinctive color of its cover. In Webster's early texts, every page, including the cover page and the flyleaf, was filled with useful information. And what did Webster print on those pages that today are usually blank? You see here Webster's 1839 speller, and on the inside of this book's cover, he used Bible verses. In this case, the lengthy passage from Ecclesiastes 12, beginning with,
Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, where the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them.
Yet it was no surprise that Noah Webster should have placed the scriptures in his text, for his philosophy of education was clear.
The Christian religion is the most important, and one of the first things in which all children under a free government ought to be instructed. No truth is more evident to my mind than that the Christian religion must be the basis of any government intended to secure the rights and privileges of a free people.
Webster's school texts therefore not only included rigorous academic exercises, but they also contained moral and religious lessons. And Webster did not hesitate to acknowledge the important role that Christianity had played in the establishment of America as a successful independent nation. For example, in this famous textbook, his History of the United States, a history and government text long used in our public schools, Webster taught students,
The brief exposition of the Constitution of the United States will unfold to young persons the principles of republican government. And our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion.
Webster concluded by reminding students how important it was to America that our citizens should observe the precepts of the Bible.
The moral principles and precepts contained in the Scriptures ought to form the basis of all our civil constitutions and laws. All of the miseries and evils which men suffer from, vice, crime, ambition, injustice, oppression, slavery, and war, proceed from them despising or neglecting the precepts contained in the Bible.
George Washington was another strong supporter of sound education, a fact made clear throughout his presidency, from his signing of the Northwest Ordinance in his first year, through his message to Congress calling for the establishment of national universities and academies in his last year. However, Washington's educational philosophy had been revealed long before his presidency. In 1779, Delaware Indian chiefs brought some of their youth to George Washington, asking that they be trained in America's schools. Washington received those youth, assuring the chiefs that
Congress will look upon them as their own children.
that is, that we would look after and train Indian youth with the same care and diligence that we did our own youth. Washington then commended the chiefs for their decision to bring their children to American schools, telling them,
You do well to wish to learn our arts and our ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. These will make you a greater and happier people than you are. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention.
according to George Washington, what youth would learn in American schools above all was the religion of Jesus Christ. Samuel Adams, known as the father of the American Revolution, also made significant contributions to American education. In this work, he set forth his educational policy.
Let ministers and philosophers, statesmen and patriots, unite their endeavors to renovate the age by impressing the minds of men with the importance of educating their little boys and girls, of inculcating in the minds of youth the love of their country, of instructing them in the art of self-government, and, in short, of leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system.
However, not only did Adams recommend that students be instructed in Christian principles, he even helped teach those principles by reprinting for the school classroom one of the most famous of all American school books, the New England Primer. The New England Primer, the first textbook ever published in America, was originally printed in Boston in 1690 and was reprinted frequently over the next 2 centuries, including the edition by Samuel Adams. By the way, most textbooks then were small, because since schools were often far away, the small size of the books made them easier for students to carry or to place into their saddlebags if they rode to school. Well into the 20th century, the New England Primer remained a common text from which American students learned to read. Over its 2 centuries of use, the cover page of the Primer could change from edition to edition, but the Primer itself maintained 3 core elements: the rhyming alphabet, the alphabet of lessons for youth, and the shorter catechism. Notice the content of the first core element, the rhyming alphabet, and recall that for 2 centuries, this alphabet was a key part of public education in America. A, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. B, heaven defined, the Bible mind. C, Christ crucified for sinners died, and so on. The second key element of the primers was the alphabet of lessons for youth. This section was the ABCs in a bold column running vertically down the page, with each letter of the alphabet accompanied by a Bible verse. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother, from Proverbs 10:1. B, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith, from Proverbs 15:16. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest, from Matthew 11:28, and so forth. The third section common to the primers was the shorter catechism. Before looking at this section, realize that the primer was the equivalent of a first grade textbook. Even though there were no grade levels in early American education at that time, the primer was the beginning reader. It was where students began. So today we would call it a first grade textbook. Notice these first grade questions. Which is the 5th commandment? What is required in the 5th commandment? What is forbidden in the 5th commandment? What is the reason annexed to the 5th commandment? We were teaching the 10 Commandments in America's public schools? Yes, for centuries. Not only was the New England Primer reprinted by Samuel Adams for students in Massachusetts, but it was also reprinted by Benjamin Franklin for students in Pennsylvania. This might surprise many today to learn that Benjamin Franklin was involved with such a religious school book, for he's considered to be one of the least religious of our founding fathers. It is true that Franklin was one of the least religious founders, but ironically, he definitely was more religious than many so-called religious individuals today. In fact, it is not even surprising that Franklin would reprint such an overtly religious school text, for he had long demonstrated his support for teaching Christian principles in public education. Recall the fact already discussed that Franklin helped found schools for African American students where both academics and the principles of Christianity were taught. However, 2 decades before that, in 1740, Franklin had helped found the University of Pennsylvania for the explicitly declared purpose of instructing youth in the knowledge of the Christian religion. In 1749, Franklin even authored the famous piece entitled Proposals Relating to the Education of Youth in Pennsylvania. In that work, Franklin discussed the scope and content of the academic curriculum of the new university, and he noted that in the school's history classes,
history will afford frequent opportunities of showing the necessity of a public religion, from its usefulness to the public, and the advantage of a religious character among private persons, and the excellency of the Christian religion above all others, ancient or modern.
If there is any famous American considered less religious than Benjamin Franklin, it is Thomas Paine. Yet it is revealing to see what even Thomas Paine believes should be taught in public education. In fact, in a lecture in Paris, Paine attacked the French public school system because of the secular, anti-religious manner in which it taught science.
It has been the error of the schools to teach sciences and subjects of natural philosophy as accomplishments only, whereas they should be taught with reference to the being who is the author of them. For all the principles of science are of divine origin. When we examine an extraordinary piece of machinery, an astonishing pile of architecture, a well-executed statue, or a highly finished painting, our ideas are naturally led to think of the extensive genius and talents of the artist. When we study the elements of geometry, we think of Euclid. When we speak of gravitation, we think of Newton. How then is it that when we study the works of God in the creation, we stop short and do not think of God? It is from the error of the schools, and the evil that has resulted has been that of generating in the pupils a species of atheism. Instead of looking through the works of the creation to the Creator Himself, they stop short and employ the knowledge they acquire to create doubts of His existence.
Not even Thomas Paine, the least religious of the American founders, not even he believed that public education should be so secular as to exclude religious and moral teachings. America's first educational laws, its first federal laws, and the declarations of many early American statesmen confirm that the unique American approach to a successful education included religious and moral lessons as part of academic instruction. Subsequent textbooks confirm that this philosophy of education remained intact and unaltered for centuries. These are the famous McGuffey Readers, written in the 1830s and 40s by William Holmes McGuffey, a noted university president and professor. His readers became one of the most popular textbooks in the history of American education, selling over 122 million copies in just their first 75 years of use. And these readers are still available to schools today. So profound was McGuffey's influence on American public education that he has been titled the schoolmaster of the nation. These readers introduce students to some of the best literature in the English language. And in the preface to the third reader, McGuffey explained how he had chosen his sources.
In making my selections, I have drawn from the purest fountains of English literature and have aimed to combine simplicity with sense, elegance with simplicity, and piety with both. For the copious extracts from the sacred scriptures, I make no apology. Indeed, upon a review of the work, I'm not sure but an apology may be due for not having still more liberally transferred to these pages the chaste simplicity, the thrilling pathos, the living descriptions, and the matchless sublimity of the sacred writings.
Similar acknowledgments can also be found in other of his readers. It is therefore not surprising that those famous literary readers contained lessons such as the character of Jesus Christ, the Golden Rule, extract from the Sermon on the Mount, Solomon's wise choice, the goodness of God, gospel invitation, Christian light and hope, consolation of religion to the poor, awake Zion, own prayer, and other similarly strong religious pieces among the other literary works. In fact, the McGuffey text even had lessons on the Ten Commandments, lessons taught in our public schools. By the way, it is significant that three of the most widely used school texts in America's educational history, the New England Primers, the Webster textbooks, and the McGuffey readers, all taught the Ten Commandments to students in public schools. Another famous educator was Emma Willard, a pioneer in education for women. She championed academic education for American women and started schools for women in which subjects such as math and philosophy were taught, academic subjects never before taught to women in American education. Willard also authored a number of textbooks, and like other successful educators, she included religious and moral lessons within the framework of academic instruction. For example, this is her famous textbook on world history, called A System of Universal History. Notice where world history begins, with biblical creation. Notice the progress of world history following creation. It is simply a recounting of biblical history. The deluge, or the flood, the Tower of Babel, Babylon founded, Nineveh built, call of Abraham, Sodom destroyed, Joseph sold, Jacob goes down to Egypt, Moses born, and on it continues through world history. African American education was another emerging area of American education in the 1800s, and John Chavez was a famous African American educator in that period. Although he grew up in a segregated America, he nevertheless studied in higher education at prominent colleges of Princeton in New Jersey and Washington, now called Washington and Lee, in Virginia. As a black man in the 1830s, he broke through many walls of North Carolina segregation and not only preached to white congregations, but he also educated both white and black students in his school. And many of his students went on to become governors or senators or other influential leaders. John Chavez taught students a rigorous academic program, and like all other successful American educators of any race or gender, he never divorced religious and moral lessons from academic instruction. Another famous African American educator was Booker T. Washington, one of the most significant of all black educators. He not only headed the famous Tuskegee Institute, but he also started a Bible college to improve education for gospel ministers in black churches. His students from Tuskegee became leaders and educators in the African American community and spread all over the nation. Washington's own practice was to spend time in the Bible every day, and he incorporated religious exercises into the academic studies at Tuskegee. In fact, Tuskegee students not only received religious and moral lessons during the course of their regular academic studies, but they were also required to attend chapel services where Booker T. himself delivered lessons and sermons. Since it was the practice of black schools, white schools, women's schools, and men's schools to include religious and moral lessons as part of academic instruction, it's not surprising that the schools that opened their doors to all students, regardless of race or gender, also included religious and moral lessons in their academics. An excellent example was Oberlin College in Ohio. That school was founded in 1833, and some years later, the Reverend Charles Finney, a prominent minister during the Second Great Awakening, became its president. Oberlin was one of the first colleges in America to admit men and women, blacks and whites, as equals. That school had a profound impact on American education and culture. Many of its students became some of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad, guiding escaping slaves from the South to freedom in the North. And many of Oberlin's students also founded a number of famous universities, including a number of black universities. The academic program at Oberlin was rigorous, and it included religious and moral instruction. In fact, Finney boldly declared,
A good education is indeed a great good, but if not sanctified, it is odious to God. The very acquisitions of education that will give you higher esteem among men will, if unsanctified, make your character more utterly odious before God. Perhaps you are a polished writer, or a beautiful speaker, or you stand at the head of the college in these important respects, or your friends look forward with hopeful interest to the time when you will be heard of on the floors of senates, moving them to admiration by your eloquence. But you have no piety.
Daniel Webster was another famous American from that era who had a direct influence on American education and educational institutions. Webster served 3 decades in Congress, was Secretary of State for 3 different presidents, and personally argued and won several cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. One such case dealt with a public school in Philadelphia that forbade any minister on campus. It was believed that this provision was an attempt to prevent religious instruction at the school, and that provision was odious to attorneys on both sides of the case. At the court, what from others might have been nothing more than a dry legal argument, from Webster's lips became an emotional appeal on the importance of preserving religious instruction at the school. His argument before the court lasted 3 days, and on the 3rd day, Webster's argument was taken almost completely from the Bible. His argument from that day was quickly published and distributed across the nation as this work. It is called Mr. Webster's Speech in Defense of the Christian Ministry and in Favor of the Religious Instruction of the Young, delivered in the Supreme Court of the United States. In that argument, Webster reminded the court,
When little children were brought into the presence of the Son of God, his disciples proposed to send them away. But Jesus said, Suffer little children to come unto me. Unto me. And that injunction is of perpetual obligation. It addresses itself today with the same earnestness and the same authority which attended its first utterance to the Christian world. It is of force everywhere and at all times. It extends to the ends of the earth. It will reach to the end of time, always and everywhere, sounding in the ears of men with an authority which nothing can supersede. Suffer little children to come unto me.
Webster opposed any education that excluded religious instruction, any school that forbade children to come unto him at school. After Webster's argument, how did the court rule? In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court declared,
Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, without note or comment, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the school, its general precepts expounded, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament?
The Supreme Court protected the philosophy of education that had been introduced into America over 2 centuries earlier. In fact, over a century after that case, in the 1950s, the court reaffirmed a similar position toward religious instruction in schools.
When the state encourages religious instruction or cooperates with religious authorities by adjusting the schedule of public events to sectarian needs, it follows the best of our traditions. For it then respects the religious nature of our people and accommodates the public service to their spiritual needs. To hold that it may not would be to find in the Constitution a requirement that the government show a callous indifference to religious groups. That would be preferring those who believe in no religion over those who do believe. We find no such constitutional requirement.
This was the position of the Supreme Court on the issue of religious instruction in public schools well into the 20th century. And it was the same position held throughout American education in 4 different centuries. Much clear and unequivocal evidence has been presented to prove that American education long included religious and moral lessons. It mirrored the philosophy long before set forth by reformer Martin Luther, whose influence on public education was substantial. In fact, recall the emphasis on education so apparent among America's early settlers? Much of their conviction about the importance of public education had come from the teachings and example of Martin Luther, who had advocated and encouraged the formation of public schools in Europe to help eliminate the illiteracy that had both characterized and perpetuated the Dark Ages. The educational philosophy of this world-renowned educator had been clear, and it was the same philosophy embraced in American education for centuries.
I would advise no one to send his child where the Holy Scriptures are not supreme. Every institution that does not unceasingly pursue the study of God's Word becomes corrupt. I greatly fear that the schools, unless they teach the Holy Scriptures diligently and impress them on the young students, are wide gates to hell.
For centuries, American education included religious and moral principles within student instruction. and there is no question of the academic success of that philosophy. However, there have been great changes in recent years, efforts to completely secularize public education. The results have not been good. In fact, to verify the weakness of the current approach, simply look at the present condition of education. Since the court ordered a completely secular approach to public education in 1962, educational scores have plummeted, evidenced by the dramatic decline in college-bound student SAT scores. Furthermore, in recent international academic competitions, American high school students have regularly finished last, near the last, or in the bottom half of students in both math and science testing. In fact, in a recent international testing, although American elementary students performed above average and junior high students performed at average, American high school students finished at the bottom, thus prompting one critic to remark, "The longer U.S. students stay in school, the less they seem to know." Additionally, illiteracy has skyrocketed in America, evidenced by the fact that America now ranks a dismal 65th in the world in literacy among 200 nations, and a number of third world nations currently post higher literacy rates than the United States, whereas only a few decades ago, we had been the best. Illiteracy is so rampant that among recent high school graduates, 700,000 of them, after 12 years of public school, were unable to read their own diplomas. These are not the educational results that Americans had experienced under the former philosophy of education. In fact, it is the current decline and failure in the quality of public education, as evidenced through numerous measurements, that has produced a rapid rise in the popularity of and support for school choice. In fact, almost 24 states have now passed some form of educational choice in order to give students a way to escape failing educational systems. The educational achievements of earlier generations stand in stark contrast to those of today, and numerous American students in those early years routinely achieved at an early age what today we consider extraordinary. For example, Declaration signer Charles Carroll entered college at the age of 10. Fisher Ames entered Harvard when he was 12 years old. And Benjamin Rush graduated from Princeton when he was only 14. And John Trumbull, a law student under John Adams and a justice on the Supreme Court of Connecticut, had already read through the Bible for the first time when he was 4 years old. When he was 6, he won a Greek contest against his local minister. And when he was 7.5 years old, he passed the entrance exam to Yale University. But his parents decided to hold him out until he was 13 so that he could attend college with his peers. There are many similar examples. And while entering a university at 13 or 14 seems a young age to us today, it was not then. And the academics were harder then than they are now. Consider some other examples. Andrew Jackson, who later became a U.S. president, was only 12 years old when, as a soldier in the American Revolution, he was captured and made a prisoner of war by the British. And when John Quincy Adams was 8 years old, he performed musket drills during the Revolution with the famous Massachusetts Minutemen. When he was 14, he received a congressional diplomatic appointment overseas as secretary to the ambassador at the court of Catherine the Great in Russia. And when Constitution signer William Livingston was 14, he moved in among the Mohawk Indians to live as a missionary. And James Iredell, a justice placed on the Supreme Court by George Washington, was appointed to public office in North Carolina to oversee financial matters when he was 17 years old. This is almost unimaginable today, but such accounts simply were not that unusual under the American educational system at that time. If you believe that these types of examples represent only exceptions rather than the rule, then remember the 4th grade geography test in Chicago from 1862? How many 4th grade students today, or even adults for that matter, could pass that test? Or the elementary math test from 1877? Or the history test from 1882? Or for that matter, simply surf the web for 8th grade exit tests used in most states around 1890, and then have students or citizens from any age group today to try taking those tests. And remember Webster's Blueback Speller? Look at some of the spelling words that were taught in elementary schools for 150 years. Contumelious, ichthyology, bronchotomy, loquacious, mendacity, amigurous, vertiginous, oleaginous, acanthus, and there are many other words in this elementary spelling book that most of us today have probably never seen. The American system of education long benefited from the scriptural promise of Proverbs 1:7 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It would not have surprised Dr. Benjamin Rush to learn that our academic achievements have fallen significantly since the secularization of public education. For he had long ago observed,
there is the most knowledge in those countries where there is the most Christianity. And those parents or schoolmasters who neglect the religious instruction of their children and pupils reject and neglect the most effectual means of promoting knowledge in our country.
the successful philosophy of education that characterized America for centuries has undergone a revolution in recent years. A revolution not by citizen action or legislative interference, but rather by judicial activism, with courts and judges suddenly prohibiting what had been permissible for centuries. Secularization of education is the new order of the day, but recent decades clearly demonstrate that the more secular our public schools become, the less successful they are academically. Unfortunately, too many today are unaware of the massive and dramatic changes that have recently occurred in American education, and too many others are simply complacent. Yet it is important that every citizen today, whether they have students in school or not, be concerned about the condition of education. As educator Noah Webster warned long ago,
the education of youth should be watched with the most scrupulous attention. It is much easier to introduce and establish an effectual system than to correct by penal statutes the ill effects of a bad system. The education of youth lays the foundations on which both law and gospel rest for success.
every citizen should exert the time and effort necessary to ensure that schools are teaching sound content and providing a good education, and that those who teach in the classrooms, as well as those elected to school boards and legislatures, are individuals who respect, honor, and embrace the time-tested principles of a sound education. And if the leaders in schools you work with will not do so, then replace the leaders or start new schools. Remember, imparting mere academic knowledge should never be a sufficient final objective for learning, nor should the secularization of education ever become acceptable. A sound education should instill the three elements long proven to be the basis of a successful education, the three elements of religion, morality, and knowledge. These elements should be instilled in our schools, but they should also be instilled at home, at church, and throughout our communities. For 4 centuries in American education, religion, morality, and knowledge form the basis of character and achievement. Experience and common sense demonstrate that these elements are still the foundation that will enable today's students to be the solid citizens and the great leaders of the future. It is our responsibility as citizens not only to protect the proven educational philosophy that has made and has kept America great, but also to do everything that we can to transmit that successful educational philosophy to future generations, just as our forebears did throughout the first 4 centuries of American education.
Through Wall Builders, you'll experience more of America's forgotten history and heroes. You'll discover again our great moral, religious, and constitutional heritage through award-winning DVDs, tapes, CDs, books, and other exciting materials. America's Godly Heritage, Wall Builders' premier video, clearly shows us the beliefs and ideals that once guided our nation's founders. Those ideals have now all too often disappeared, and in America's Godly Heritage, David Barton documents the tragic results. This compelling video is galvanizing support across the country from Americans who want to see this nation return to its sacred roots. Setting the Record Straight reintroduces this generation to the forgotten heroes and untold stories from our rich African-American political history. There's Joseph Hayne Rainey, the first African-American elected to the U.S. Congress. Reverend Frederick Douglass, first African-American appointed to office in 4 presidential administrations. Reverend Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first black U.S. senator, and many others. Filled with exciting reenactments and dramatic events, Setting the Record Straight is an inspiring look at the values and courageous contributions of African-American leaders to our nation's heritage. The powerful video, The Spiritual Heritage of the United States Capitol, winner of both the Angel and Telly Awards, brings to life the exciting religious history of our nation's most cherished landmark. Through dramatic reenactments, you'll experience the great events and inspiring lives that shaped our nation in its early years. Through a compelling video tour, you'll marvel at the works of historical and religious art displayed throughout the building, and you'll discover the true stories of the many godly heroes honored within its chambers. Featuring the only existing tour of the Capitol on video, the spiritual heritage of the United States Capitol is an unforgettable journey you don't want to miss. In the role of pastors and Christians in civil government, you'll discover how the church played an invaluable part in the struggle for America's independence. You'll learn about the leadership of Christian founders in establishing American government. By carrying out teachings found throughout the pages of the Bible, Christians changed the course of a nation. The Angel Award-winning video Keys to Good Government reveals why scandals seem to plague public officials today. You'll learn valuable insights from great early leaders such as William Penn, Noah Webster, Benjamin Rush, John Adams, and George Washington. And you'll see how they explain both the loss of integrity and the strategy for restoring it in public life. In the Foundations of American Government, you'll take a look at the powerful effect biblical principles had on public policy in our nation's history. You'll examine founders' statements surrounding the First Amendment. Then you'll see statistics showing the downturn our country has made following the disastrous 1962 Supreme Court decision rejecting the founders' intent. Each of these compelling videos is available on DVD, VHS, CD, and cassette. Also available are thought-provoking audio messages including faith, character, and the Constitution, the Bible and the judiciary, and many more. Order at wallbuilders.com today. In addition, Wall Builders offers a wide variety of intriguing works in print. America, To Pray or Not to Pray is David Barton's classic, well-researched examination of the decline of values in America and the staggering social problems created as a result. In Original Intent, David Barton looks at a wayward Supreme Court that has victimized the religious aspect of the First Amendment, separation of powers, legislative supremacy, and many other protections guaranteed by the Constitution. In the words of the justices themselves, the court has become a national theology board, a super board of education, and a group of amateur psychologists on a psycho journey. In repudiating these activist ideas, Original Intent goes back to thousands of primary documents written by leaders in American history. It shows the founders' ideas about the true place of the Supreme Court in government. For a detailed and intensive biography of one of America's greatest founders, read Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence. The brilliant leader who served under 3 presidents, started the nation's first Bible Society, and as the leading physician of his day, earned the title Father of American Medicine. David Barton relates another exciting but little-known account from history in his book, The Bulletproof George Washington. Enjoy this miraculous true story of God's intervention in battle to save George Washington's life. Another valuable resource is the handy Documents of Freedom, containing the nation's 3 founding documents in a convenient pocket size that's perfect for giveaways or quick reference. In addition, don't miss these historic reprints, Ethics, an Early American Handbook, Lives of the Signers, Noah Webster's Advice to the Young, the 1777 New England Primer, and many others. Also, take a look at Wall Builders' Great American Posters series. All are available through our website at wallbuilders.com, where you can place your order quickly and easily, or write to us at P.O. Box 397, Aledo, Texas 76008. For information, call 817-441-6044, and for phone orders, 1-800-873-2845. Contact us today.